We're assuming for this session that you're completely new to the consumer data right. Obviously, if you turned up, it's not by accident. You didn't just jump on Eventbrite and start randomly clicking on data regulation workshops, because there's not enough of them for that to be a subgenre. But we're assuming you're interested in the regime. You're trying to understand what maybe you're part of an organisation that's either wanting to participate voluntarily as a data recipient, or you're an energy retailer, or associated sort of organisation or a vendor who is hoping to support an implementation effort or required to implement according to the CDR requirements. We are aware, though, that the energy sector is new to the CDR. There's been a lot of ongoing discussion, but not with everybody in the sector. And so we're starting this session sort of at baseline to get everybody on the same page around what the CDR is, the different organisations that are involved, what their roles are, how to engage with them, and what's already there. Because we're quite aware that a lot of water has gone under the bridge. The regime's been going for 3 years now. If you've been following the regime at all, you will be aware that the first sector for the consumer data right was the banking sector. And in fact, a majority of customers in Australia in the banking sector are now covered by the CDR and able to share data for their accounts. And that's been a journey that's been ongoing. And the energy sector is not coming in clean or greenfields or cold or whatever phrase you want to use. It's coming into a lot of stuff that's already been established and is already in place, which is daunting for new people coming in because there's a lot to understand and learn. But there's also major advantage to it. A lot of the issues we had to work out in the banking sector has already been sorted out for the energy sector, and will be even further for the telco sector, which will come next. So this whole process that we'll be doing today is assuming you're coming in without any preconceived notions or lots of understanding. And so that's how we'll be running this. The first thing to articulate is the organisations that are actually involved, and I'll let them talk about their roles more deeply. But the actual organisations that are involved in managing the CDR start with the Treasury, the Federal Treasury, which has the lead on the CDR as a regime and as a policy area. And within the Treasury, there are multiple teams. There's the data standards body, there's teams that do rules, there's policy teams, and there are teams looking at future directions and program management and so on and so forth. The key functions we'll be touching on today will be the rules making, policy and rules making function. We'll be explaining something about the difference between designation instruments and rules and so on and so forth. And the other major team in the Treasury is the data standards body, of which myself and Jared and Mike are a part, and we work on the technical standards. There are two other major bodies involved in the CDR, however. One is the ACCC, which performs multiple functions for the CDR, and the other is the OIAC. The ACCC and the OIAC together are co-regulators of the CDR regime, and I'll let them talk about them in those sections when we get to them and fill in any gaps if people have any questions. But for now, that's a bit of an overview of the whole and the different teams and the different groups. But for the next section, I will hand over to Fiona to talk about her work in the Treasury.
Hi everyone, my name is Fiona Walker and I work in the Rules for New Sectors team within Treasury's Consumer Data Right Division. That team, together with a team that works on the rules generally, within the Regulatory Frameworks branch of the division, and I have some of my colleagues here today, as well as the head of our branch, Jodie Ross, and I've also got from my team today helping run through the slides, Matt Hose. So thank you, Matt. We might move on to the next slide. So we're going to start at the beginning today what is the consumer data right? And while I've called this a presentation on an introduction to the consumer data right for the energy sector, there's very little energy in this presentation. We're really looking very broadly at what the consumer data right is. So it's an economy-wide reform that's designed to empower consumers to benefit from data. As everyone says, data is the new oil. And there's obviously enormous amounts of data that Australian businesses hold about consumers. And we want, CDR, the sharing of that data to strengthen competition and innovation and productivity. So there's two types of data within CDR. There's consumer data and product data, and we'll touch on them in a moment. But consumers can request that data about themselves, i.e. consumer data, that's held by businesses is to be securely shared with an accredited third party, which might be a price comparison service or a financial management app, or, in energy, maybe a provider of solar panels that wants to optimise the consumer's arrangements with their distributed energy resources. And so the CDR facilitates that sharing of data. The data that's covered by CDR is, as I've mentioned, consumer data, so information about a particular consumer and how that customer, like whether it's an individual or a business, uses a particular product or service. So in energy, it might be data includes metering data, so how the customer is consuming energy. But there's also product data, which is held by businesses, and it relates to the characteristics of a product or service. And so in energy, that data is held by the Australian Energy Regulator, which runs its Energy Made Easy comparator service, and as well as in Victoria by the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, which runs the Victorian Energy comparator service. So CDR facilitates the sharing of both those types of data. Next slide, please. Thanks, Matt. So a bit more background on the consumer data right. The consumer data right is currently being implemented in the banking sector and works well underway to implement CDR in the energy sector. If any of you have had a chance to look at recent draft rules we've released, we're looking at a 2022 commencement for the consumer data right in the energy sector. That's what we're proposing in these draft rules that are currently under consultation. We are also entering an expansion phase of our CDR program and looking at additional data sets which will be assessed for designation each year. So the government has commenced consultation on the next sector, which is subject to a sectoral assessment, as we call it, for designation under the consumer data right. And I'll come to the concept of designation a bit later, but at the moment, the government is consulting in relation to the telecommunications sector, and we've concluded consultation on a paper that looks at whether or not that sector should be subject to the consumer data right. So the consumer data right's a fundamental part of the government's digital economy strategy, and it's considered to be one of the measures that's going to assist in our recovery from the economic impacts of COVID-19, as well as driving productivity growth and providing new opportunities for Australians. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the regulatory framework for the consumer data right. The legislation is contained in Part 4D of the Competition and Consumer Act, and the legislation sets out the high-level framework for the consumer data right, but much of the detail of how the consumer data right will operate is left to rules and to standards. The way things work is that there is a designation instrument which the minister must make in order to effectively switch on the consumer data right for a particular sector. And once that designation instrument has been made, it sets out the parameters for the consumer data right for a particular sector, specifying the data holders and the data sets that can be part of the consumer data right, and then the rules effectively provide the detail of how all that will work. And, a data set could be named in a designation instrument but not necessarily be shared through the rules. So that the designation instrument is the absolute limits of the framework, but the rules don't need to deal with everything in the designation instrument. The rules are empowered to contain rules on anything that's in that designation instrument. I'm not sure if I've explained that too well, but we can come back to that later. And then there's standards which set out the detail of the actual data that's going to be shared, the payloads and so forth, and James will talk about them a bit later. But basically we have in banking the designation instrument, and then we have rules that apply across all sectors as they're brought in. So there is a set of rules that applies right now only in banking, but when energy is brought in, those rules will apply to banking and energy. And when telecommunications is brought in, those rules will apply to banking, energy and telecommunications, and so on. And then we have sector-specific schedules in the rules that deal with any issues that are very specific to a particular sector of the economy. I think I'll move on to the next slide here. Thanks, Matt. So looking at the overall roles and the responsibilities with respect to the consumer data rights, so the Minister for the Digital Economy, Senator Jane Hume, is our Minister, and she is responsible for the overall policy settings for the consumer data right, and is the responsible Minister for Part 4D of the Competition and Consumer Act, in which the CDR legislative provisions sit. She's also responsible for the process of designating any further sectors that are subject to the consumer data right in the future. And she is also responsible for making the consumer data right rules. Then we have the Data Standards Chair and the Data Standards Body. So the Data Standards Chair is the statutory role under the Part 4D of the Competition and Consumer Act that actually makes the data standards. And the Data Standards Body is the advisory body to the Data Standards Chair. Andrew Stevens is the Data Standards Chair, and so he is responsible for making technical standards and consumer experience standards on the advice of the Data Standards Body. He also runs a Data Standards Advisory Committee for industry and consumer and government representatives to provide advice on the formulation of the data standards. The ACCC is one of the two regulators that's involved in the consumer data right, and the ACCC runs a consumer data right register and accreditation application platform. So the register is effectively where all data holders and accredited data recipients in the ecosystem can be found. The ACCC is also responsible for decisions on who to accredit as an accredited data recipient. There's a process and requirements in the consumer data right rules for basically entry tests for any party that wishes to become accredited to receive consumer data, and the ACCC is the decision maker for anyone that's seeking accreditation. Once the ACCC has accredited a party, they become an accredited data recipient and they can be found on the register. And just answering a question that's just popped up, yes, we can make these slides available to everyone after the presentation. The ACCC is also responsible for enforcement and compliance of obligations under the legislation and the rules. The Office of the Australian Information Commissioner provides guidance on privacy safeguards. So the Competition and Consumer Act sets out some privacy safeguards that apply, that are based on Australian privacy principles, but that apply to various parties in the CDR ecosystem. There's specific privacy safeguards for accredited data recipients and for data holders that set out the privacy requirements, and OAIC provides guidance on those privacy safeguards, and they'll be speaking later in relation to that. OAIC is also has a co-regulatory role with the ACCC in relation to enforcement and compliance, and also does complaints handling in relation to complaints regarding the regime. So the other thing to note is just that the rules and standards are supplemented by guidance. OAIC has a private guidance, provides guidance, but also the ACCC and data standards body provide guidance on various issues as well. Next slide, please, Matt. Okay, so I mentioned before the concept of a designation instrument. That's a statutory instrument that's made by the Minister for the Digital Economy that sets out the scope of the consumer data right in the sector. So it specifies the data holders that will be subject to consumer data right obligations, and it also sets out the data sets in the sector to which the consumer data right applies. So there's a designation instrument for the banking sector, and there's also a designation instrument that was made last year for the energy sector, which sets out that energy retailers will be data holders for the purposes of the consumer data right, as will the Australian Energy Market Operator, or otherwise known as AEMO, and the Australian Energy Regulator and the Victorian agency DELP that's responsible for running Victorian Energy Compare. So they're specified as data holders for the consumer data right, with retailers holding the consumer data and AEMO also holding various data sets that relate to consumer data, and the AER and DELP are specified as data holders of product reference data. So the retail plans effectively that are available in the energy market. So those data sets that relate to the supply or sale of electricity, including where it's bundled with gas, and include information about energy products, whether they're electricity, gas or dual fuel plans. They're all subject to the designation instrument. The rules don't need to deal with everything in a designation instrument. So just because an entity is specified as a data holder in a designation instrument doesn't mean that the rules have to specify data sharing obligations for that entity, but it's specifying the outer bounds, and in energy, all retailers are captured through the designation instrument. So an example I want to give to make this really clear is in energy with the designation instrument. I've just mentioned that all retailers are captured in the designation instrument, but not all retailers are participating in the wholesale national electricity market. So the rules for the CDR and energy, the draft rules that we've released for consultation actually only bring in a very large subset of all authorised or licensed energy retailers. So the rules sort of narrow down the operation of the designation instrument to say that only retailers that are participating in the wholesale electricity market are subject to CDR obligations. So I'm hoping that that example sort of illustrates for you how a designation instrument works, and that the rules can further narrow down the operation of the CDR. The designation instrument is just providing the outer limits of how things can work. Thanks, Matt. I'll move to the next slide. Okay, so the consumer data right rules, they basically, we have several guiding principles that have been developed through a review of the rules that was conducted by Treasury, and those principles are universality, prescription, and simplicity. So, we acknowledge there's always a bit of tension maybe between prescription and simplicity, but the idea of the rules is that basically wherever possible they should apply in a sector neutral fashion so that they can easily accommodate any future sectors that are designated and subject to CDR obligations. And then the extent to which the rules apply in a particular sector it's subject to some prescription, which is generally in a sectoral specific schedule, and that will deal with any very particular issues related to a sector. So in the draft rules that we've released for the CDR and energy, the broad arrangements for data sharing are set out in the body of the rules, and they are universal, so they won't necessarily just apply in energy. The peer-to-peer model that we're looking at, which I can touch on later, could be taken up in a further sector, but the energy data sets are specified with some degree of prescription in a schedule to the rules. So we try and have that balance between having universal principles-based rules and more prescriptive and detailed rules. And we also have regard to simplicity and, the ease that users have in reading and interpreting and applying the rules. The rules are legally binding once the rules are made and enforced, and they do include civil penalty provisions. The rules also set out the commencement date of certain obligations. So in the draft rules that we've released for energy, we've specified that AER product reference data sets, we propose that the commencement date for them is October 2022, and that's the same for consumer data that's held by AEMO and AGL Origin and Energy Australia. Obviously, those are draft rules and no decisions being made, but the rules deal with commencement dates. So in terms of where to find the CDR rules, there's a federal register of legislation, and if you work through, you can, and I think when you've got the copy of this, you'll be able to click on the link. But that's where you'll find an up-to-date copy of the rules. We also have the rules available on the Consumer Data Right website. Treasury has concluded consultation recently on draft amendments for version 3 of the rules, but those changes have not yet been implemented. However, what we'd expect is that those changes will be implemented before version 4 of the rules, which includes energy, is made. So right now, version 3's consultation is concluded and version 4 is open for consultation. And if you look at the amendments on our website, you'll see that version 3 changes are marked up in blue to signal to stakeholders that they are not subject to consultation as part of the consultation on the draft energy rules, but to provide context so that you can see the proposed energy amendments in light of what's just been consulted on. And the proposed energy amendments are marked up in red, and those are the aspects of the current draft rules that we're seeking stakeholder feedback on, just the amendments marked up in red. Thanks, Matt. Just to go through the CDR rulemaking process, so we've got one box there at the top left that says development of draft CDR rules. Now, there's a lot of work that goes into the development of policy before draft rules are developed, and you know, depending on the sector, for energy, For energy, there wasn't a sectoral assessment process. We had transitional provisions that recognised the work that was done by the COAG Energy Council with its Houston Kemp review of third-party data access sharing. And so the process of development of the energy rules was slightly different to what you'll see going forward, because we didn't have that sectoral assessment process that was undertaken under the Part 40 of the Competition and Consumer Act. So going forward, you would have consultation in relation to the application of CDR in a sector, as we're looking at right now with the telecommunications sector, and then a decision made to whether or not to make a designation instrument designating a particular sector, which basically switches on the consumer data right for that sector. After that, the consultation process might be, for example, what we've done in energy was we did a design paper on the peer-to-peer model and released that in April this year and sought stakeholder feedback. So there were, then we moved on to developing the draft CDR rules following the feedback from that design paper. But if we start at the development of the draft CDR rules, they would be approved for release by the minister, and then there's a public consultation process on those draft rules that must occur for a minimum of 28 days, and Treasury must consult with the ACCC, the Information Commissioner, and the primary regulator or regulators of the particular sector. So in energy, that's the Australian Energy Regulator and the Essential Services Commission of Victoria. So that's the stage we're in right now, with energy submissions close on the 13th of September, and then we'll be reviewing those submissions and developing final CDR rules. We also need to conduct a certification process in relation to the regulatory impacts of those proposed changes and a privacy impact assessment. And then that package of rules and the privacy impact assessment would be put to the minister, and the minister makes a decision on approval of the final CDR rules. Once the minister has made those rules, they're then placed on the Federal Register of Legislation. So that's the process for the CDR rules. Then there's the data standards, and the standards impose legal obligations where they formally commence and where the rules require them to be complied with. In addition, if a standard is stated to be binding, then under Part 40 of the Competition and Consumer Act, a form of statutory contract exists between accredited data recipients and data holders that requires compliance with the binding standards. So the rules require those binding, if the rules require binding data standards to be made about certain things and actions, then they must be conducted in accordance with those data standards, and non-compliance with the data standards can result in enforcement action by the ACCC. And for binding data standards can also lead to action being taken by a party that's aggrieved by a CDR participant's failure to comply with the binding data standards. If there were ever to be any inconsistency between a data standard and the rules, then the rules would prevail over the data standard to the extent of any inconsistency. Thanks, Matt. Okay. So I've touched before on the process that we used for CDR in the energy sector. I mentioned the Houston Kemp report, which was a very a report that was done by the consultants Houston Kemp for COAG Energy Council on how sharing of energy data with third parties might occur in the energy sector. And that report made some recommendations on how the consumer data right in energy would operate. Following on from the recommendations of that report, Treasury consulted on the data sets that would be subject to designation in the energy sector and subsequently released a draft designation instrument for consultation. And in June last year, that designation instrument was made. At that point in time, the ACCC was responsible for rules development and conducted consultation on a rules framework for the energy sector. That policy and rules development role has been transferred to Treasury. And I mentioned before that Treasury consulted through a design paper consultation on the data access model for energy. The designation instrument provided some flexibility in relation to the potential to use a gateway data access model, which was the data access model that Houston Kemp's report recommended. But following further feedback from stakeholders, the Treasury had a further look at the data access model and recommended to government moving to a peer-to-peer data access model under which retailers would obtain AEMO data sets from AEMO and package them together with retailer-held data sets for sharing purposes. There's a slide in a moment that explains that in more detail. We're now at that second last step here in terms of draft rules consultation, and then final rules will be made, and the approximate timing of that is around October. Thanks, Matt. Okay. So the key parties in the consumer data right are obviously consumers, and consumers aren't necessarily, an individual person. They can be a person, an individual person, or they can be a legal person, such as a business, or they can be a partnership as well. All these parties are eligible to use the consumer data right and come within the definition of a CDR consumer. Then we have accredited data recipients. There's a number of accredited data recipients, and you can find them listed on the ACCC's register. And we anticipate that, over time there will be more and more accredited data recipients, and that will increase the number of offerings and data-driven innovation, and to the benefit of consumers. The other key parties in the CDR are data holders. So in the banking sector, initially the four major banks were brought on first, and then data sharing obligations for the non-major banks started later from 1 July this year. In the energy sector, I've touched on AEMO being a data holder, so that's the market operator for the energy sector, as well as retailers, and the rules, as I mentioned, will specify that is just, those obligations will just be on retailers that are active in the wholesale electricity market. Treasury is currently looking at what data holders in telecommunications may be designated if there's a designation instrument made for that particular sector. And we're also looking more strategically at how the CDR as an economy-wide reform might apply in other sectors, and how it should be implemented across the economy. Thanks, Matt. So this slide shows the flows effectively for consumer data sharing in the banking sector, and this model would be appropriate for many sectors. It's not quite the model we're using for the energy sector, but it's a model that's highly extensible to many sectors. So effectively the steps are that in step 1, a consumer consents to an accredited data recipient obtaining their data. And then in step 2, the accredited data recipient contacts the data holder, which might be a bank, seeking access to the consumer's data. And in step 3, the data holder authenticates that the accredited data recipient is who they say they are using the register of accredited persons, the CDR register that's run by the ACCC. In step 4, the consumer is then redirected to the data holder's authentication and authorisation service, and they're authenticated via a one-time password, and the consumer will authorise the data holder to disclose their data to the accredited data recipient, after which the accredited data recipient will request the specific data that the consumer has authorised them to seek, and that data will be shared between the data holder and the accredited data recipient. Thanks, Matt. In energy, we have a slightly different model for peer-to-peer, just reflecting that on the right-hand side of that graphic, you've got AEMO as a data holder. So the steps are slightly different because after the consumer's given their consent and the accredited data recipient is approaching a data holder, the accredited data recipient will go to a retailer, irrespective of whether they're seeking retailer-held data or AEMO-held data or both. And it's the retailer that's responsible for authenticating that the accredited data recipient is who they say they are using the ACCC's CDR register. And then the consumer is redirected to the retailer's authentication and authorisation service. And it's the retailer and not AEMO that's responsible for authenticating the identity of the consumer in that process, because AEMO is not a consumer-facing entity. But once that process has occurred, then the accredited data recipient's been authorised to request specific data, then the retailer will request that data that's covered by the authorisation from AEMO to the extent that that data is not part of the retailer's consumer data holdings. And AEMO will provide that data to the retailer. The retailer will package any data that they hold, as well as that's been requested, as well as any AEMO held data that's been requested, and share that with the accredited data recipient. Thanks, Matt. So, look, that really takes us to the end of this introductory session on the CDR. And I just want to mention the next steps on version 4 of the rules. That's the amendments to bring in the energy sector, just because that's the only rule change that we are currently consulting on. And consultation will close on 13 September. After that, Treasury will be reviewing submissions and finalising drafting of the rules, and then we are aiming to submit a package of rules to the Minister in October.
Over to you, Shona.
Thank you, and thanks very much, Jared, for controlling the slides for me today. So I'm Shona. I'm an Assistant Director within the CDR policy team at the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, and today I'll be giving you a brief introduction to what the OASC does, our role within the CDR, and also give an overview of some of the resources that we've produced to assist consumers and participants. And I'm happy to take questions at the end through Slido or even via email offline after the presentation, if that suits. Next slide. Thanks, Jared. I apologise for the number of times that you'll hear next slide. So for those of you who aren't particularly familiar with the work of the OASC, we operate as an independent statutory agency established under the Australian Information Commissioner Act. So we promote and uphold privacy and information access rights and have a regulatory oversight of this across the whole economy. So the OASC has 3 key functions: privacy, protecting the privacy of individuals under the Privacy Act, freedom of information and information policy, and the integration of these functions means that our office is well placed to strike the right balance between confidentiality and transparency, and between the right to privacy and the right to access data and information as well. And ultimately, our vision is to increase public trust and confidence in the protection of personal information and access to government-held information. So next slide. Moving now to the OISC's role within the CDR specifically. So the CDR, it's a co-regulatory model by the OISC and the ACCC, and the ACCC regulates the broader CDR system, while the OISC is responsible for regulating the system's privacy aspects. So this includes enforcing the privacy safeguards as well as the CDR rules that relate to privacy and confidentiality. So we promote advice, we provide advice to Treasury and the data standards body on the privacy implications of the CDR rules and the standards. And we also have an investigative role. So we investigate complaints about the handling of CDR data from individuals and small business consumers. And we also have a guidance and education role as well. And we've issued a suite of guidance materials for entities regarding their privacy obligations, as well as web content as well. So next slide, please. So as I said before, the CDR scheme, it's co-regulated by the OISC and the ACCC. And this co-regulatory model reflects the joint competition, consumer and data protection drivers behind the scheme. And given that the CDR is co-regulated with the ACCC, we apply what's called a no wrong door approach. So if the OISC or the ACCC receives a matter that's best dealt with by another agency or an external dispute resolution body, will transfer that matter across to them. So consumers or regulated entities can lodge their inquiries, reports or complaints via the CDR website. We also have an online complaint tool which will automatically send through the contact to the relevant agency or determine whether both agencies need to provide a joint response to it. Next slide. So before we delve into the privacy obligations under the CDR system, I just wanted to run quickly through some of the basic CDR terms, and Fiona went through this before as well, but it's also relevant for privacy. So a data holder is a business that holds the consumer data and must transfer that data through to an ADR at the consumer's request. For example, a bank in the banking sector or retailers within the energy sector. And in energy, accredited data recipient has been accredited by the ACCC to receive consumer data to provide a product or service. And we have this information within the privacy context in our privacy safeguard guidelines. So chapter B, key concepts, if you'd like to do some further reading. Next slide. And as Fiona said before as well, there's a lot of sort of steps involved in the flow of information between data holders and ADRs and consumers, as shown here. We've got this information in chapter C of our privacy safeguard guidelines. Next slide. So now to privacy. So there's 13 privacy safeguards, and these obligations are contained in Part 4D of the Competition and Consumer Act, and they're also supplemented by the rules. And these privacy safeguards set out the obligations for participants in the CDR, and they're broadly based on the Australian privacy principles under the Privacy Act. So importantly, the safeguards will only apply to CDR data where there's one or more consumers. And this means that for the safeguards to apply, at least one person needs to be identifiable from that data. And the safeguards don't apply to handling of product data, for example. And the other important thing to note is that the legislation itself sets out the safeguards at a really quite a high level, and then further prescription and detail is given under the CDR rules. So when you're considering compliance with the safeguards under the Competition and Consumer Act, you'll need to consider these really closely together with the CDR rules. So the good news is we've published some CDR privacy guidelines, and they outline how the OASC will apply the 13 privacy safeguards, and these bring together the requirements from the Competition and Consumer Act with the CDR rules, so everything's in the same place. And each chapter of these guidelines explains who the safeguard applies to, for example, an ADR or a data holder or both, and it also outlines the interaction of that safeguard with the corresponding Australian privacy principle. So a question we get a lot is, when do the APPs stop for the general handling of information? When did the privacy safeguards begin? And then how do those two interact with the handling of consumer data? Generally, for accredited data recipients, the privacy safeguards apply instead of the Australian privacy principles. And for data holders or retailers in the energy sector, generally the APPs are generally applied to the handling of data. However, there are a handful of privacy safeguards that will apply instead of the APPs. So Privacy Safeguard 1, which relates to having a CDR policy, a complaint process and good governance processes generally to navigate the different compliance obligations under the CDR. Privacy Safeguard 10, which relates to notifying consumers about disclosure of data under the system, and also Privacy Safeguards 11 and 13, which relate to the accuracy and correction of CDR data that's disclosed. Next slide. So in addition to the guidelines, we've also published two guides called the Guide to Privacy for Data Holders and the Guide to Developing a CDR Policy. And we've also got some web content for participants and consumers on the privacy safeguards and other obligations more generally, so information about consent, authorisation, and consumer complaints processes as well. And we've also just last week published a couple of videos for participants to understand their privacy obligations in relation to Privacy Safeguard 1, having a CDR policy, and other complaint processes. So these are available on our website as well as cdr.gov.au. Next slide. Thank you. So before I wrap up, I just wanted to run you through some screenshots of our website to make your navigation journey a bit easier. So if you head to www.oisc.gov.au, or you can just Google OIC and usually we come up, you'll see this page. So if you note across the top under the OIC ribbon, there's various tabs there. And if you, so after About Us or Privacy, you'll see Consumer Data Right, which is the last one. So if you click into that, you'll be able to see the different resources available depending on which capacity you're in. So next slide. So this will take you, it'll start with consumers. And then if you keep scrolling down, there's participants. So importantly, that first box there is the CDR Privacy Safeguard Guidelines, which are the different chapters that I was talking about before. And then next to it, on the right-hand side, there's Guidance and Advice, which are the two guides that I was talking about before, the Guide to Having a CDR Policy, as well as the Data Holder Guide to Privacy. Next slide. So thank you. That brings me to the end of our presentation. So I'm happy to take any questions now, and I've also popped up our OISC CDR email address in case anyone has any questions afterwards.
I do not have slides. I have standards to show.
Cool, that's up on my screen.
You can see that? Excellent.
I might want to zoom in a bit as it is small text. So,
okay, how's that?
That's better, thank you.
Okay, so my name's James Bligh. I'm the lead architect for the data standards body, and I've been working with the CDR since its inception in mid-2018. And have been involved in developing the standards during that period of time. The purpose of this section, and I'll be joined by Mike Palmyre, who is my peer looking after the CX side of the data standards. between the two of us, we will go through all of the existing data standards that exist and how you can engage with the standards, how you can request them to be changed, how you can understand them, where you can get clarification if you don't understand them, etc. The real goal of this section is not necessarily that you will understand every line of the standards, but you'll know what's there. You'll have a broad understanding of what is defined, what is left to be defined for the energy sector in particular, but also so that you've got an understanding of where you need to go so you can find out more. So that's my goal. If I don't meet that goal, please hound me with questions until you actually get that outcome. So the site that I'm showing at the moment is, and Jared, could you put the links in chat?
Yes, I will do.
You probably have the links to pretty much everything I show here. So if you could put them in chat, that'd be good. These are all live and public. So this site that I'm looking at the moment is the data standards site. This is where the current version of the data standards are currently published. And if we scroll down here, it's made into 3 panes. The left-hand side is the contents. The middle side is the main standards that you can read and has all the statements in saying you must do this, you must do that. And on the right-hand side, we have what we call non-normative examples. So the examples here should not be taken as definitive standard statements. They're just examples. It might look something like this type thing. The white column in the middle is the part you read to understand the standards and what's in them. Okay, so I'll scroll up the top and zoom in a bit so people can see it a bit better. If I look on the left-hand side here, these top-level headings indicate the main areas of the standards. So we have some introduction, which I'll go through in a moment. We have some high-level standards. We have what's called the information security profile under the security profile header. We have consumer experience, which I'll let Mike talk through shortly. And then the rest of the section here is really about API definitions, so the actual payloads, endpoints, etc., that will be defined. Then at the bottom, we have more administrative stuff. We have the non-functional requirements, known issues, and changelog. I might just touch into the changelog and the archives. In the archives, you can actually go back and see every version of the standards we've ever published. We maintain full archives so you can go back and compare and see these things. And then in the changelog, we actually take you through the changes that have arisen, how they arose, etc., and where you can actually find in the standards what has changed. So if I click on a release notes there, you can actually use this to determine, well, okay, what was the difference between version 1.10 and 1.11, and so on and so forth. Most of that is administrative. We do use versioning for the standards. We use semantic versioning, so that's why there's 3 parts, and we have a definition of how we manage versioning as well. If I scroll right to the bottom of the table and contents here, we'll also see that there is a link here to the draft energy standards, and I'll show you those shortly. We also have links to Swagger and JSON and some other important links here, but I'll also highlight the CDR register. So draft energy standards and CDR register are ones that I will link to a bit later on. So heading straight back up to the top, in the introduction, we've got really 2 major parts to the standards. We have the endpoint version schedule, which is basically related to change in the standards and how we roll them in, and future dated obligations, which again is related to change in the standards. Now, this will not be immediately of impact to the energy sector, but it is currently of significant impact to the banking sector, and it's really important for participants in the energy sector that are starting to engage with implementation and what it would mean to implement to the CDR standards to really understand what these sections mean and how we manage change. Change in the standards is not managed through big bang change. Legislation changes that way, rules tend to change on a much longer cycle, but with the standards, we are quite iterative and deliberately so, because we have been finding as we go forward that particularly, for instance, around information security, We can't change at our pace. We need to change at the industry pace with information security in a lot of cases. Also, the standards can be quite complicated, and as we go through implementation, people find things and they say, oh, well, we need to change this, or can we change that, and they make requests. So we have a process of rolling change. As a result, we change the standards on a fairly regular basis. We try and keep those changes very minor, so there's lots of minor change, but they're continuous. And as we do that, we phase the changes in. So for instance, if I just take a random example here, get product detail V2 for banking, we made this change. We introduced version 2 of the get product detail endpoint, and then we said that data holders may obsolete version 2 of this endpoint from May 31st, 21, because we introduced the next version as well. As new versions come in, we obsolete old versions, and then we say you have to have this one by this stage, and you have to have concurrency for a period of time. All of those obligations that we do to manage the ecosystem so that you don't have a situation where everybody needs to release on a single day. We manage that all through these future dated obligations, and we manage them through the endpoint version schedule. So that's the first thing you see when you come here is the introduction and those future dated obligations. If we then move into the high level standards, this is like the rest of the standards really start at the top and work down. Throughout the standards, we define our terminology. We align to RFC 2119, so must has a very specific meaning, must not has a specific meaning. And we try and align to that throughout the standards. We then have a series of principles, and these principles are used to guide how we evolve the standards going forward. Now, this is a really important area to highlight because particularly with new entrants coming in, there are millions of ways to create RESTful APIs. There's a lot of different ways of doing various things with technical solutions. Any engineer knows that. We use these principles to keep consistency over time. So we start with that they need to be secure. We try and use open standards wherever possible. It's not always possible for various reasons, but we try and use open standards wherever possible. We need it to be a good customer experience. It needs to be a good developer experience. So archaic, difficult to use APIs are not good APIs, for instance. We need to be consistent across sectors. This one here is going to be very important for the energy sector. It has been for those that have been engaged. This is the second sector, with banking being the first. We worked very hard with the banking sector to not make it a banking standard. We were always thinking, as we were developing the banking sector standards, that there are other sectors coming. We didn't necessarily know what the sectors were. We knew that energy and telco and superannuation were all being mooted. We didn't actually know, but we knew more sectors were coming. And we do know that energy will not be the last sector. There will be another one after that, and then another one after that. So we have tried to develop these standards to be generically good and to quarantine any sector-specific change in the standards, so it's very clear where that is. So anyway, I'll leave you to go through these principles at your own leisure. But there's a whole lot of them. We start off with the high-level ones and then drill down. And there's a lot in here about consumer experience and how we define a good consumer experience. If I look at the table of contents on the left-hand side, I won't go through all of it, but in the standards here, we have how we do versioning, how we change things in the standards, how we define different versions of payloads, etc., the definition of a path, so how you create a path for an endpoint, headers, response codes. If any of the engineers on the call, you'll see that you'll recognize these things. All of these standards here apply to all sectors. These are not bank specific, they are CDR specific, and they are CDR generic across sectors. So ID permanence, pagination, common field types, error codes, etc., will be applicable for the energy sector. So everything I've shown you so far is entirely 100% applicable for the energy sector. But we are not consulting on this stuff at the moment. This stuff is seen to be defined. We've consulted on it in the past. We've got various people that have implemented it. We are not looking to change these items unless there's a very good reason to. And if we did change any of these items, we would be changing it for the banking sector also. So any change we do here is not going to be stylistic, because the implications are 100 odd banks are also going to have to implement that change. The next section to touch on here is the security profile. The security profile is quite long. It's an entire information security profile defining how transport security works, how an ADR is authenticated with a data holder, how a data holder is authenticated with a customer, how a consumer authenticates with both, how data is transferred, the whole thing. So this section here, all the way from overview down to informative and normative standards, is applicable to the energy sector as it stands. It is constantly being consulted on. And I'll show you later on where we do the consultation and how you can engage with that. But there is not going to be an energy infosec profile and banking infosec profile. There is just a CDR information security profile. There's two reasons for that. One is we haven't found a reason why we need a different one. And that's a good reason not to do something different. Change for the sake of difference isn't good difference. But the second reason is it's just a better approach. And it's a better approach because it creates a single surface of attack. We don't have to manage lots of different profiles that each could have different vulnerabilities. We can manage the whole thing together and assess everything together. And we have lots more eyes on it, and means we have a much more robust consultation process on the information security profile, and much more likelihood of picking up things that could result in vulnerabilities. Also, an ADR only has to implement one profile, even if they want to be cross-sectoral. So it means that the value of going cross-sectoral for ADRs who can now do cross-economy experiences, and bearing in mind data holders can also be data recipients, and we already have in the banking sector some of the banks becoming data holders, who are data holders becoming ADRs. Because anybody can become a data recipient, it is in everybody's interest that there's a standard way for doing this for all data holders, so that an ADR can go across sectors to create services for consumers that are of value. The information security profile would take an afternoon in itself to go through and do justice to. So I won't go through the whole thing in total. I will emphasise a couple of things, and then people can go and have a look at it. The first thing to highlight is the CDR Federation section, which actually defines. There was a question in Slido earlier around a customer versus a data recipient. We actually define our terms here. You know, what is a data recipient? What is a data holder? What is the register? What does it do? What is a customer? We also define here the authentication flows. So we are leaning on OIDC extensively and the financial API profile maintained by the OIDF. The financial grade API profile is not just for finance. It's a financial grade profile, which means it's a high security profile. We have determined for CDR, even in its least secure context, is a high security context. We do not want to have a low watermark for the CDR. So we are using financial grade security for the entire profile, which is why we lean on the FAPI profile there. And we use OpenID Connect as an industry standard for three-party data sharing or consent management. So this goes through all of that. The other thing I wanted to highlight here is the normative references section. So we actually lean on a lot of normative references. So the standards that we see here are quite extensive, but if you think about the normative references we're also leaning on, and these includes just JSON Web Token, JWK, JWS, or MTLS, all these things, there's actually quite a deep technical basis to what we're doing here. And so looking through these normative standards, you can get some indication of what we're building upon. By the way, for those not familiar with the term, normative means that it's part of the standard. You know, you count this as part of the standard. Okay, the next section is consumer experience. And to break up so you don't have to listen to my voice too much, I will now stop sharing. And if you're ready, Mike, I will hand over to Mike, who will talk about the consumer experience section and what you can expect to find and where you can expect to find it.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, so hopefully everyone can see that and it's zoomed in enough there. So for those that I haven't met yet, I'm Michael Palmyre, the Consumer Experience Lead at the Data Standards Body. And so what I'm going to just be doing now is going through the Consumer Experience Standards and also touching on the Consumer Experience Guidelines, noting that there is a distinction between the two. But in this section here, there's, as you can see down the side, just as James discussed, there are various elements within the Consumer Experience Standards that we've chunked up accordingly. And what you can see, I guess, first is probably the most pertinent to at least the energy stakeholders on this call today. And that's because data language standards are obviously sector specific. So what we currently have here in the data language standards relates to banking sector data as opposed to energy sector data. So obviously that's going to be expanded on to accommodate the energy sector and to describe the energy sector data sets as well. But what the data language standards actually seek to do is present data sets to consumers in a way that is comprehensible. So what you can see, there's terminology used here, data clusters and permission language effectively here. So on the right, we actually have a visual. This is what a consumer would see, for example, when an ADR is requesting transaction details from them. They're asking that consumer to share their transaction details. So at the top here, we've got transaction details, and underneath we have something that is called permission. So it's the additional information or additional description of the information that would be shared as part of transaction details. So these standards apply to data recipients and data holders whenever they're presenting that data to a consumer. So the consent flow, authorization flow, dashboards, and so on. It's chunked up, I won't go into detail here, into various sections based on the data sets. But as an example to kind of talk through, and James will probably touch on this next, it maps to the authorization scopes. So we have, for example, this is the data cluster language that a consumer would see. These as the permissions that if they wanted to dial into the detail, they could see in addition to this data cluster language, and it's reflecting the data that would actually be shared as part of this authorization scope. So that's a kind of detail there of how that would work. And obviously we've got a decision proposal being developed at the moment relating to AMO held and retailer held data that we did work on workshop last year as well. And we're not expecting to change too significantly from that point. But obviously this will be expanded on to reflect those energy related data sets as well. Moving down this list here to accessibility standards, that's another element. Obviously, the consumer experience standards relate a lot to what a consumer actually interacts with and how they interact with the CDR, which is a kind of a level above or a kind of lower level of detail, perhaps, to what the rules and technical standards do at times as well. So what this kind of refers to here, to aid things like comprehension, accessibility, and so on, it refers to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, so we're CAG. And this is a statement for CDR participants to seek to comply with these. And there is flexibility in that, noting that obviously in some contexts it doesn't make sense or it isn't possible to comply with these like non-digital formats and so on. Moving on to the next section, this is broken up very much in terms of the consent model itself. So consent, authentication, authorization, and management, so dashboards, is how these sections are effectively broken up. I won't go through these in detail here, but these relate to consent, authentication, and authorization. But I will just stop in the authorization section for a moment because this is a useful one to kind of touch on now. But the rules, for example, do not allow additional elements to be introduced to the authorization flow by data holders unless supported by the rules or standards. So what we have here are obviously some things relating to account selection, profile selection, and so on. But you will note that in some of these, we have some softer language. So the nomenclature, that we use is obviously aligned to the technical standards, must, should, may, and so on. But there are a lot of shoulds and mays down here. So it's worth noting there that what we're actually doing is creating additional flexibility within the authorization flow, not requiring data holders to implement these certain items, but allowing them to, if they need to cater to certain scenarios. So that's additional utility of the CX standards in this context, is to actually increase what could be added to the authorization flow if required to tend to a certain scenario. And that's what these elements here seek to do in relation to unavailable accounts. And that obviously relates to the energy sector, particularly with things like secondary users, for example, given the provenance that might have. I'll skip over the amending authorization standards. That's a kind of probably a 102 session as opposed to 101 to just go over the basics, but I'll finish here on the standards section with the withdrawal standards. So the withdrawal standards apply to both data recipients and data holders depending on the standard. They are specified here, whether it's data holder or data recipient. But what these standards effectively relate to are where a consumer may be withdrawing something like a consent or an authorization or a permission, like a secondary user instruction. And these are effectively done, most likely on a dashboard. And these standards just relate to what ought to be communicated to a consumer as part of that withdrawal process. So that's, the end of the CX standards section, but I'll just jump back to the top here because there is another element here. Obviously, the CX standards are required, they're mandatory. There's obviously optionality within those standards depending on the language, but we also have CX guidelines, which are an important element of what we'll do. So I'll just jump to that for a moment. This takes you, straight from this link to the website, our website, consumerdatastandards.gov.au. You can get to this section by going to guidelines and conventions and then CX guidelines. And what this page here shows is actually just an archive list of past CX guidelines that we had. And this is the one that I'm wanting to point you to now, which is a new platform that we've been using since December to host our CX guidelines. So this is where you can find our CX guidelines. And CX guidelines, as this disclaimer at the bottom notes, they provide optional examples of key requirements and recommendations. So key aspects of the rules, technical standards, CX standards, obviously incomplete, and recommendations from the research that we've been conducting and other literature that we've been reviewing, going all the way back to 2018 as well. Obviously, these are examples of how to implement those key items. So it's not a complete list. There are elements that would need to be tended to separately. And obviously the obligation to comply is on the CDR participant. So this isn't necessarily, a certificate. It's an example of how you might implement, though the rules do note that CDR participants should have regard to the CX guidelines. So they are a benchmark and reference point, if you will. So there are some, key elements in the CX guidelines. I'll jump into the actual CX guideline in a moment, but I do want to briefly touch on some other artifacts that we hold in here. So a few things that are worth reading through here, metrics that we've used to assess things like informed consent and comprehension and so on. But I will jump into this one here because this might be useful for the people on the call today, and that's the CX checklist. And we've developed this based on community requests. And it is effectively, it's worth jumping to this bit here, the read first, but I won't go into that detail. It's a complete list of items that we reference in the CX guidelines. So not a complete list of everything, but what we reference in the CX guidelines. So what we actually have here is a very long list of things because we reference a lot of rules, technical standards, CX standards, guidelines, and so on, privacy safeguards in our CX guidelines. And what you can see here in this list, there's kind of unique references. There's some key columns here that are probably going to be of most interest around what type it is, whether it's a CX standard or a rule or a guideline, who it applies to, a data holder or a data recipient, maybe both, the obligation level, whether it's a must or a should or a may, the statement itself, and then a link here to where you can actually find a guideline for this element and when it was introduced as well, which is the whatever version of the standards it was when this element was introduced or released, and the date as well that it was introduced to help tracking there. So that's useful, it's downloadable, but has been used and requested by particularly compliance people and designers, obviously, because it is helpful as a starting point to understand where those elements surface to the consumer in the consent model, for example. Again, really emphasizing that it isn't a complete list, but I think maybe the only one that kind of goes to it in this level of detail across different obligations as well. I'll jump back now to just give you one example of an actual guideline or a guideline page that we have. So these guidelines are broken up into aspects of the consent model, just like the standards where it goes consent, authenticate, authorize, and consent management, which is dashboards for data holders and data recipients there. So what I'll do here is jump straight into authorize, noting that there are probably a lot of prospective data holders on the call, retailers in the energy sector. And I'll jump to this section here, which is authorize, and just quickly walk through one example. And what we have in these pages is a high-level overview of what authorize refers to, where it sits in that consent model process, and some key elements here, and also potentially variations. So like I showed in the standards page, there's kind of the straightforward consent flow where you have authorization, and there's perhaps the CDR 102, which is amending authorizations and some additional elements as well that kind of go beyond initial consent being established. So I'll jump here to the authorization to disclose, which is effectively the process of the data holder after receiving a request from an ADR to seek consumers' authorization to disclose that data to an ADR, to the ADR requesting that data. So in this example here, authorization to disclose, similar structure. We've got a few elements here, but this is the stuff here. So we have a default example. We use Figma heavily to show what this would look like in practice to a consumer, potentially, noting that they're optional examples. These are all able to be interacted with. I won't do it now because I'm scared of what will happen if I'm doing this while screen sharing, but you can maximize the screen to make it full screen as well. And what these are wireframes, illustrating what it could look like to implement key rules, standards, and recommendations, and so on. These are annotated, color-coded as well. So you can see, if I jump down to this one, for example, underneath here, we have a guideline table of key requirements and guidelines. So if you look to number 5 here, and you go to number 5, that's a rules reference here. If you go down to one of these blue ones, say number 18, you jump down further, and that's what you can see here as a guideline reference. So these are all here. We have another way of kind of accessing this, but if you jump down to here, we also provide a prototype example of this, so you can kind of see it in practice here. So this is, quite literally just the authorization flow of the basic example there, and it shows those elements there, prototype, so you can see how they are linked together for the authorization flow. We do have these different elements here, variations and so on, and you can see here, if you just kind of open it up, it's the same thing, has guidelines, wireframes that are annotated, and tables there that you can look to as examples. And moving down the bottom here, and I'll kind of wrap up here, we have open source assets for each of these guidelines too. So here you can see download open source asset, and we have all of these elements available here in a downloadable Figma file. So these are version controlled. You can see that this open source asset was created to align with version 1.11.0, and here is the date as well. And these Figma files contain everything that you can see on this page. They contain these wireframes here in those as well, and they have effectively a table that is the equivalent of this table down here in that design file, so you can map accordingly and have everything you need there. And these are typically also linked up as a prototype, so you can open up that prototype view in Figma to see how they work there too. These are all based on the Australian Government Design System website, so they have been reviewed for accessibility compliance as well internally. So you can be confident that from our perspective, we've reviewed them based on how to correctly implement the CX standards, and there are other elements in there as well that would be useful to consider. So it is not necessarily something to directly implement. Obviously, there's brand and tone changes that need to occur, but it is a starting point to kind of reduce barriers to implementing quickly. So for those on the call, especially in the energy sector, it might be of interest for compliance people and designers and so on. So take a look at these, play with them to understand how these work, to have useful reference points for your own implementations there too. That's it from me. I'll wrap up there and hand back to you, James, before we can take questions at the end.
So where Mike left off was in the consumer experience standards and guidelines. So I'll pick up the next level here, which is in the actual APIs themselves. Now, the way we divide up the APIs is by sector. And this is deliberate to allow for a cross-sectoral model where not every data holder will implement every API. Obviously, there'll be no obligation for banks to implement energy endpoints or energy retailers to implement banking endpoints. So what we have in the binding standards, which is in this formal site here, is we have the banking APIs. You can go and have a look at them if you like. We have them all under /banking to indicate the sector they're a part of. However, the thing I wanted to highlight here is the common APIs. So /common indicates that these are cross-sectoral APIs depending on designation. Now, customer data is designated for the energy sector. It is also designated for the banking sector. We anticipated this. So we actually, for the banking sector, created the customer APIs as cross-sectoral endpoints. The reason for this is that a customer represents an individual or business. It doesn't represent an energy customer or business. It represents an Australian person or business. So there's no point having the bank version of that, the energy version of that, etc. So what we've done is we've got a generic customer API here, common customer API here, that we'll be using for each sector for which customer data itself is designated. We also have down here admin APIs, and the admin APIs are for things like interacting with the register, metrics, things of that nature. We also have under here, I believe, I think they're under the common APIs, we have status and outages, which are unauthenticated APIs in that they are able to be called publicly, but they indicate the current status of an implementation or whether any planned outages are in the future, so data recipients can plan accordingly. So the common APIs and the admin APIs will be in scope for the energy retailers implementing for the energy sector. Mike referred to the authorization scopes. We have a model for allowing for high granularity scoping of data. We've been consulting in various contexts on finer granularity of permissioning, but we haven't actually implemented it yet because there hasn't been a use case for it. But at the moment, what we do is we have high-level scopes. Here they all are, and we have got a set defined for the energy sector along the same lines. And in each of these scenarios, these relate to one or more endpoints. We don't have endpoints, we don't have paths or APIs, whatever you'd like to use as terminology. We don't have them where they span half in one scope and half in another. We have them all in or all out. So if I have the scope of basic customer data, then there's an endpoint that I can access, and I can access everything under that endpoint. There's no partial payload. So you don't have to, like in your implementations, assess, well, does this individual field in scope? You're either got the endpoint in scope or not in scope. And I think in the entire standards we've done, there's only been one scenario where that's not been 100% the case. It was a corner case. But in general, that's the way we do it. You can do the scopes, and the scopes dictate endpoints, and then after that, you get the payload available for that endpoint without further need for scoping. So the data language standards that Mike was referring to each relate back to one or more of these scopes. Finally, we have the non-functional requirements. And so these are the performance requirements, the availability requirements, traffic thresholds, and so on and so forth that are applicable both to accredited data recipients, but also to data holders. We've just done a consultation on modifying these for the energy sector so that there's relief for retailers calling AEMO in that peer-to-peer model, so that that secondary responsibility is accommodated into the non-functional requirements. However, in general, the non-functional requirements will stand across and be cross-sectoral. So that's everything going through the standards here. There's still a lot more to show you. One of the things I haven't shown you yet is the actual draft energy standard. So we've looked at the banking APIs, common and schema. We've looked at the high-level standards. The draft energy standards are the ones that we've been consulting on for the last year or so. It's in a slightly different format because we were trialing a different format to see if it would be applicable. Once we make these binding, we'll move them into the other format. But essentially, it's the same thing. It's a bunch of APIs. And here we have the endpoints. So we've got generic plans and generic plan details, and you can go through here and see all the payloads and fields for these endpoints. And these are the ones we're currently consulting on. All of these have gone through consultation, so they're actually pretty firm. These are not just made up out of thin air. We've spent over 12 months consulting on these over about 10 or 12 different consultations. So they are progressing and solidifying. And our goal at the moment is to have these to a candidate level. You can consider that beta, or you consider that, the 95% certain range by the end of October, early November. And the reason that's not 100% is really the standards never get to 100%. Even with the banking standards, we're still changing them as people implement more and they find more. But the real reason is we can't really solidify them until the rules are finalised. So one of the things that Fiona said in her section is that if the standards and the rules are not aligned, the rules override. The standards are built under the rules. So once the rules come out and are finalised and we know what they are, we will then probably have to modify our standards to make sure they match, because we don't have 100% foresight to be able to predict exactly where it's going to be. So when we talk about candidate level, that's what we mean. We'll treat it as if this is the standards, but then the rules will be solidified and we'll review them, and then we'll finalise any last tweaks. These are all the APIs here. You can feel free to go and have a look at those. If I go back to the standards here, there is one thing I haven't shown, which is the register. So if we click on CDR register here, it takes us to this page, which is maintained by the ACCC currently. And if I go and click on the design reference, we end up with a whole bunch of new standards here for the CDR register. Now, the intention of the CDR register is that the register holds the definitive status of accredited data recipients. If the CDR regime did not have accreditation of data recipients, then you might not even need the register. You'd probably just need a JSON file saying here are the data holders and where to find them. But the register exists for a number of reasons, but one of them is so that a data holder can definitively know the status of a data recipient. So that means not any company that implements some code can just go up to a retailer and say, I'm a data recipient, let me start sharing data. The register is, if you like, the source of truth of ADRs and their current status. And that status can change. An ADR can be suspended, they can surrender their position, they can have their position of accreditation revoked, in which case the rules have specific things you need to do as a data holder. So these register standards are very important. The other thing that for data holders is this is where you go and register your endpoints and go through conformance testing. The registers are, if you like, a really important entity in the overall standards ecosystem. And this is where you can find all the stuff you need to do for connecting to the register and using the register's data as part of the authentication and consent authorization flows. The CDR standards use a thing called dynamic client registration. Dynamic client registration means that once a recipient gets accredited, the DCR flows are actually part of it's an optional protocol under OpenID Connect. But what it means is an ADR can then come to a data holder and say, here I am, please create a client ID for me and register me as a client that can ask for consent. And the DCR has a whole series of flows, including calling back to the register, confirm identity, and then the data holder will issue a client ID to the ADR, and then the ADR will use that client ID to create consents after that point. I won't go into that in too much detail, but this is why I'm just trying to illustrate the importance of the register. We're actually in the process of taking these standards and merging them into the main standards site, because the feedback we had from the banking sector was that having multiple sites to go to got confusing. It would be better to have it all together. So we're currently in the process of doing that. So by the time you guys, the energy sector starts to come along and implement, we might have already merged that all together and you just have one place to go to. But at the moment, they are separate. Okay, so that pretty much covers all of the standards. The next thing I was going to take everybody through was how to get help and how to ask for them to change. But before I do, I thought I'd go through and just give you a bit of a checklist of if you are seeking to implement these standards, what do you need to care about? So I'll give you a bit of a quick overview. So if you're a project manager, this would probably be important. From a high level perspective, if you like, I won't say epics, that's too low level, but more, chunks of scope that you need to worry about. As an energy retailer, you need to care about tariff data. Now, you probably already have this organised because tariff data is about giving that data to EME and VEC. However, we also have the concept of tailored tariff data. So in the energy standards themselves, in the draft energy standards, if we look at say, get generic plan detail, these are the APIs to be provided by EME and VEC, and they have a lot of different information about the plan. But if we look at the account detail, you will see that account detail has this thing called plan detail with a lot of the same data in it. It has metering charges, and it has all the pricing and the fees that you would normally represent through EME and VEC. And this is in the context of, not the context of a plan I could get, but the context of a plan that I already have. And this is for comparison purposes, which is why we use the same structure. And there was a question asked earlier about, EME and VCE don't hold C&I data. Does that mean that C&I are out of scope? No, they're not. C&I are in scope for the authenticated endpoints. And that means that C&I plans are in scope in an authenticated context, not an on-market context, because EME and VEC don't have that data, but they are still in scope and the data needs to be held and represented. So that's a non-trivial part of the overall scope for an implementation project for an energy retailer. So don't forget about it. The other thing I'd say is that EME and VEC, Fiona mentioned the fact that C&I data isn't in scope because EME and VEC don't hold it. If they change their system so they do hold it, and that might require regulatory change from their part, but if they did hold it, they would start to have to share it because C&I data is in fact in scope. But that's further down the track. They don't hold it, so we're not doing it accordingly. But the reason I mention that is it's actually the topic of a consultation that's currently open. The next thing you need to think about in scope is authorization server, which is implementing all of the information security and register connectivity. You then have to worry about the resource APIs themselves, which are these beauties, the actual APIs and the logic for actually creating all the payloads, etc. You then have to think about the consent screens, which are part of the authorization flow, and very importantly, the consent dashboard, which needs to be presented in an existing digital channel and allows customers to go and revoke and control and see the consents that are open. And the final one to think about, and I'm not trying to be exhaustive, I'm just trying to highlight these are the kinds of things you need to think about, is your processes and call center. There are a number of, and this sometimes get left to last, but there are a number of aspects of the standards and the rules where it allows for, say, a consent to be revoked manually, as in not through a digital channel, but by calling up or sending a letter. In which case there needs to be an assisted channel, call center, colleague channel, whatever you want to call it, mechanism for managing consent also. The next thing I wanted to show, and we're on the home stretch here now, so I'm sure everybody's exhausted, but I wanted to show how we in the data standards body consult on the standards themselves. So the site I'm currently showing here is a GitHub site. We do all of this through GitHub. If you're not familiar with GitHub, it's a public website that's used for management of open source software. Most of your organizations, the engineers will be very familiar with it, and you may even use it for your own internal source code because you can actually get private access to GitHub for management of source code. So one of the reasons we used it is because in the industry, this is very commonly understood by engineers and a wide range of different stakeholders. And it's also a very good platform for doing the kind of thing we need to do. So if we look at what we're on here, we're actually on the standards repository. We have here in the standards repository a big README about how to use this repository. And all the files that I just showed you, all that standard site is actually here. So we make it all public. So you can see us changing this. So when we make changes, you can actually do the diffs on the commits. You can actually see what changes we did when, and you can look through all of our history. So we have full transparency on every change we've made to the standards. And we manage the standards changes through the issue tracker here. So if we look here, each of these entries represents an open consultation. So if I focus on the energy sector, you'll see that there are some say industry oil, and there are some that say industry electricity. And these ones are the ones that are specific to the energy sector. We have just this week published a candidate generic tariff endpoints. So feel free to go and have a look at that. We've still got one on energy non-functional requirements, which is still open. And we've also got NIMI standing data, candidate usage endpoints, and DER endpoints. We actually only have 3 left to do in the energy sector, plus the data language standards, and then to hit the November date. So we've actually been progressing quite quickly through the energy consultations. If I show you one of these consultations as an example, I'll take the, I'll do the generic tariff one. We include here a PowerPoint document, and that PowerPoint document is basically a proposal document saying this is what we're going to do with standards. Here's the decision to be made, here's how we're going to do it, and here's the current recommendation of the endpoints and what's changed. So all of our standards work this way. So this is how we make big changes to the standards, bring in a new sector, etc. However, we found for the banking sector, we got to a point where we were doing very, very small things. And more to the point, we were doing things that where the data holders and the community members were actually requesting changes. We weren't doing them from a central point trying to meet the designation and rules. So we actually created this thing called standards maintenance. So standards maintenance is a separate repository that works on a repeating cycle, an iterative cycle, and anybody can come in here and raise an issue. And you can raise a change request and request that things in the standards change. If I just pick one at random, adding support for given names. This was raised by Westpac, and it gives a description and the change proposed, and it's got some feedback and dialogue about this particular change. You can see by the number we have here, 322 closed, 81 open. This is a hot area. This changes a lot, but each of these is very small. Usually it's a field or two that's impacted, and they're very, very minor. To get visibility of what we're doing in the future, we also have this Kanban board, which has our quarterly plan. And this is how we track what we're doing currently. We're currently in this quarter here. We've got our next quarter organised, and we're currently working through these items as we speak. The DSP is doing quite a lot, so there's quite a bit in here. But if you want to know what we're doing in the first half of next year, at least as far as we understand, this is how you can track that. And finally, I wanted to show you, the last thing I was going to show you here is the Consumer Data Right portal. So one of the things is that we found going through the previous sector, and we've already found this to be useful in the energy sector, is that we get a lot of questions. And quite often those questions are questions that we've already answered before, because usually what happens if there's a point of ambiguity, more than one person is going to hit that point of ambiguity. So we get the same questions over and over again. So we have this portal that is managed by Jared, and we use this. Through here you can actually ask a question. And we track it like a trouble ticket effectively. And Jared hounds me and the other guys in the team to make sure we're answering our questions, because he's very much a customer advocate for you guys. And we answer those questions, and then he and the tech writers in his team turn them into articles. So you can actually see here a whole series of articles, and you can search for articles. We have different categories here. And this is an invaluable source of information. If you've got a question and it's to the generic standards, information security, etc., the likelihood is someone else has asked it. There's not a huge amount of energy stuff in here because the energy standard hasn't sort of settled yet, so we're not getting into that mode of supporting it. However, for the actual existing standards, there's lots of stuff in here. So please come here and have a peruse and look through it. There's some great stuff in the guides. There's some excellent FAQs, and we're just about to expand this out to include test cases to support testing regimes and regression test suites and things like that.